Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast series. Uncovering God in the creative arts. At the biggest international arts festival in the world, Sanctuary First stops to ask, where does faith and art meet?
And welcome to Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast series that seeks to engage with actors, creatives and musicians who have come to the Edinburgh International Fringe Festival. And we're delighted that you've been able to join us for this podcast, and we hope that you will be able to get back to us with your comments and your observations as the podcast proceeds. I'm Albert Bogle, and I'm joined by my colleague, Hannah Sanderson, and together today we've got with us our special guest, who is Beck Hill.
Hi.
And we're looking forward to having a chat and talking with Beck. Now listen, Beck is an actor, a comedian, and famous for her flip charts and her puns and her play on crazy misheard lyrics.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I do love a misheard lyric.
Yeah, and so you've been blessed with so many talents that we're going to have a really interesting time getting together, chatting with you and talking with you, Beck, today.
Oh, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
So listen, the first question I'm going to ask you is, you've come to the Fringe, but in actual fact, in past you've had your own show. Why haven't you got your show this year?
I didn't have anything to write about yet. I think Fringe is something that you should only do if you have something that you want to do that needs to come out, that you need to say. It's so relentless and difficult otherwise, and if you're not really sort of feeling it or passionate about what you're talking about, then it can really wear you down. And in the past, I would be doing a show at Fringe and I would have an idea for the next show, and so then I would come back, the following year or maybe the year after that, after working it up. And there was a show in 2019 I did called I'll Be Beck, and I'd had the idea for that for years. So I'd been also working that up slowly in the background while I did other shows. And then I did the 2019 show and realised I didn't have an idea for the next show because I'd been building up to that one for so long. And so just sort of, excuse me, I just took a little bit of a break. And I'm just enjoying watching stuff now. Yeah.
Being a punter.
Really nice. I'm being a punter. And do you know what? My goodness, I couldn't understand why people would come to shows who weren't doing the Edinburgh Fringe, and now I understand. It's lovely. You don't have the same anxiety every day. There's no stress. I'm sleeping better. I'm eating better. Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Just as exhausting, though. So how many shows have you seen so far? And you've been here for 24 hours?
I've been here since Thursday. Today's Tuesday. Oh, my goodness. Let's see, that's how many. Yeah, so I think I've seen about 25 shows.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So have you got any inspiration come out of it for shows for the future, for some writing projects?
I have actually. Yeah, that's the first time in a while that I've started to go, ooh, yeah, okay, all right, I want to talk about this, and I think I might sort of focus on this a bit. There's been some shows that I've seen that have had really interesting structure, and that's been really inspirational because I like a bit of structure in a show. Then there's other shows that have been a bit more chaotic, and I like physical comedy. I find that there's something really nice about that sort of transcends any language. I mean, I always say to my mum, because my mum's very silly, and she gets along with people of all ages, of all backgrounds, ethnicities, everything. And I always say to her, it's because they speak silly and you speak silly, and silly is a universal language that everyone understands.
So Absolutely. What I'm seeing is then we need a Mrs. Bean. So obviously Mr. Bean being the king of physical comedy and popular all over the world. I mean, maybe Mr. Bean could have a niece.
Yeah, a Ms. Bean.
A Ms. Bean.
Ms. Bean. Yeah.
Of course, the other comedian, because I'm a Glaswegian, Billy Connolly is absolutely brilliant in acting out if you watch him performing.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
The capers he gets up to, the big baggy trousers or the banana, the banana wellies or whatever it is, Yeah. Isn't it?
It's a really nice way of standing out. And again, it's that anything that he talks about that could get a little bit serious or a little bit, I guess, sometimes with adult themes and that sort of thing as well, to undercut it with that ridiculousness, the surrealness, or the silliness. It's a really nice balance, and I think that's what makes him more accessible and more mainstream, weirdly.
So is it all? Have you been watching all comedy shows that you've been at? Have they all been comedy? And
I saw a show yesterday called Shadow Kingdom. It's on at 11:15 at Assembly Roxy, and that's a shadow puppet show. And so that was much more of sort of storytelling. There is some comedy in it, but it is mostly a storytelling show, a narrative show, and that felt like having a little bit of like a meditative moment. It was just a nice reprise from seeing all this like bam, 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 where you sort of you get a little bit out of your head with trying to keep up with everything. And this was nice just to sit there, and it's in the dark because it's shadow puppetry, so it's really dark, and you're sort of watching this beautiful, beautiful paper stuff. I do a lot of stuff with paper, but this was, just another level. And really, really enjoyed that. I would say it's a nice, for anyone who this might sound familiar to, I would say it's like the Studio Ghibli films, but as a shadow puppet with a little bit of Never-Ending Story, Labyrinth, that sort of lovely 80s nostalgic fantasy. Yeah, it's lovely.
So obviously we read your bio on your website before you came here today. So we feel like we know you inside out. But I was really interested by, you mentioned puppets there, you mentioned papercraft, mentioned storytelling, and I know that you do the DC fan cast.
Oh yeah, I mean that's how much this needs updating, because that was some years ago.
And then we've got your podcaster, which is actually a maths podcast as well. So I'm wondering why you chose, of all the clearly bucket of talents that you have, why comedy? What drew you as a person to comedy, and when did you know that was drawing you in?
My family's always bonded over comedy. As I said, silly is a universal language, and we used to watch. If we're going to get very therapeutic, I think some of my happiest memories are moments where my family was sitting down watching TV, things like Red Dwarf. Yeah. That was a huge influence. I was about 7 when I started watching that. Didn't understand a lot of the jokes. As an adult now, I realise they're probably a bit inappropriate, but I loved it. And The Goodies was really big in Australia as well. Weirdly bigger in Australia than it was here. But and obviously Mr. Bean and things like that. And I remember sitting with my family and watching that and just laughing so much, and watching stand-ups on television. In Australia, they have the Melbourne Comedy Festival, and each year they would televise the Melbourne Comedy Festival Gala, which was a bit like Live at the Apollo, but once a year. And so we'd all tune in to watch this, and I remember going to school the next day and trying to remember all the jokes that I'd heard and chatting to my friends about it. And so it'd always been something that made me feel happy, and it was really nice to see it make other people happy. It was a real bonding moment. And so I think I was just naturally drawn to it that way. And so it was a bit of that. And then also I loved acting. I loved doing drama, but I never got chosen to be the main role. And I remember saying to my drama teacher, why don't you ever choose me? Because clearly I wanted it so bad, and I would rehearse so much for the auditions, and I'd try my hardest. And he always cast me as the comic relief.
Yeah, the comedy character.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was like, why don't you ever make me the lead female? Like, why don't I ever get to be sort of the Juliet or anything? And he said, and I don't know how much of this was him just trying to soften the blow or just general, but he said, because playing the comedic character is a lot harder, and there are fewer people I can choose that would be able to pull that off. And obviously that was the right thing to say to me, because I went, okay, yes, I will take that as a compliment. And then I started to realise that that's what I like more than acting. I like making people laugh and being on stage, but I don't necessarily like playing other people. And so I just sort of found myself drifting towards stand-up. It wasn't a job when I was growing up. It wasn't an occupation. So I never planned on it being my full-time career, but I knew I had to do it. As soon as I finished high school, I had to go and give it a shot. And then kind of just kept going from there.
Beck, you're also an author, and you've produced a series of children's books entitled Horror Heights.
Yes.
And is that complete now? Is the whole series complete now?
Yes and no. So there's 3 books out now. They work alongside of each other. You can read them out of order. I have 10 other stories that I'd like to... Originally, it was meant to be one book of 13 short stories. And then the publishers said, we love this. Could you turn each story into a book? And it was the beginning of lockdown, and my tour had been cancelled. And so I didn't have any other work on the horizon. And I said, yes, of course I can turn them into full books. And that turned out to be a huge challenge, trying to stretch that out, because I'd never written anything that long before. You know, even an hour-long solo show isn't as long as a chapter book. And so they commissioned three books, which I've done. So that's that. But if there ends up being demand for more, there are 10 other stories in the back pocket. So, and if I don't end up getting commissioned them, I might have to get around to at least writing them as short stories, so that any kids out there can have a bit of a completion. So
if our listeners haven't come across Horror Heights, you should realise that perhaps the title Horror doesn't completely illustrate the books, because there's tales about science experiments that have gone wild, and everyday troubles of just young people. So it's a bit of fun in the midst of it all as well, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I think horror and comedy go together perfectly hand in hand, because they're both about building tension and breaking it. It's if I would say that comedy is almost what happens if you take horror further than you would. So with horror, you'll build tension, but there's unknown. And it's that unknown that creates an unease with an audience. But with comedy, you build tension, and then you deliver a punchline. And it's that release of that, bringing the unknown into the known, that will make people laugh. And so it's just, they're sort of so similar to each other.
Check you out with your academic look on horror and comedy.
Absolutely.
Ooh.
I'm also thinking about this. Here's an idea for you.
Yeah.
I think there's opportunities for you to take some of the Bible stories and make them into horror. And
I mean, some of them already are.
They're there. They're there, Albert.
A lot of them are.
But you could do something with that as well. There's something there, perhaps. Parables of Jesus,
Absolutely.
the tension, the breaking. I don't know. Just throwing that out as another.
Yeah, there are some crazy ones. I mean, the whole, taking your son up a hill to sacrifice him thing. I mean, surely that's sketch gold right there for breaking the tension.
Absolutely. The Old Testament is rife with some stuff. I would say C.S. Lewis has done the Jesus analogy. I'm never going to try and top that. It's just perfect. I do think there's a lot of comedy in the Bible, though. I think my favorite passage, I think it's 2 Kings. I think it's 2 chapter 22. I think it was 2:22. It's when Elijah is walking out of Bethel, I think it is, and some youths come out and they start chanting, "Go on up, you bald head! Go on up, you bald head!" Or baldy in some versions of it. And then Elijah calls a curse on them, and 2 bears, or in some versions 2 she-bears, which for some reason is funnier. Just that she-bears come out of the forest and maul 42 of the youths. And I just think that's hilarious.
I mean,
someone
it's a
got
new
called
approach.
bald and was like, "Yeah, well, take this bear attack." Brilliant, great.
New approach to youth crime.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
exactly.
Just going to set some she-bears on you,
Yeah, that's what we should do. That it's more money in counselling, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I'm interested that I think there are some themes through on your bio. Just read the bio. So storytelling is obviously a really big theme in all that you do. And I'm wondering whether, you said that a long time ago you did that superhero stuff. And I'm wondering whether there's that theme of a story about good versus evil, that story of that battle, that story of darkness and light. Do you think that there's something, obviously you've mentioned there that you read the Bible, so I'm presuming that you have a Christian faith. I don't want to jump in there and presume that. But do you think there's something in us as humans that wants to hear stories of good versus evil, of dark versus light? Do you think that's an inherent thing in humanity?
I think it is. I think almost more than good versus evil, because I think sometimes when we put things up as good versus evil, because a lot of us don't feel like we face pure evil in day-to-day life. And so it almost makes those stories almost fantasy. Like we think, oh, that's nice to think about. That's what it would be like. But it's harder to relate to our everyday life. And I actually just think that it's more stories of a smaller battle of morals and ethics versus the smaller versions of, I guess you could say evil, but I guess just more that internal battle that we all have about what's the right choice to make for others, for ourselves, what can we do in our lives. I find those stories much more fascinating. And I think it's those parts of the Bible that I find the most interesting, the moments where Jesus is, his 40 days of temptation and stuff. I think that's where the power is, that to show that this person who essentially is a socialist and a really interesting leader also battled with those things and had to deal with them and overcome them, is so much more interesting than the idea of this, Superman versus, I don't know, a giant mechanical spider.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, that is in the Bible, I think. I mean,
that one's in the Bible.
The giant mechanical spider. Yeah.
But then again, there's a lot of similarities between Superman and Jesus. They're both from above.
Yeah.
Absent
parents, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Brought up by other parents.
Yeah, the laser eyes.
That was my favorite part, actually.
Yeah, totally. But I wonder, do you think that Christians have a reputation out there in the world as being funny? Like, if you stop somebody on the street and you said, give me 5 adjectives about Christians, do you think funny would be in that list?
Oh, absolutely not. No. I think maybe people think they're funny in that we're laughing at Christians and not with them. And I think that's a shame, because I think whenever I've come across humour, especially within church, it's always made me feel a bit more. There was a church I went to in Melbourne and I remember thinking, this is my church. Because it always takes me a while to find, if I'm in a place, to find the congregation that I feel at one with. And I remember walking in, and they're using the old school projectors, so they'd had to print stuff out on the little laminate. And the minister said, today we're going to be talking about the Trinity. And then he put down a laminate with Trinity from the Matrix on it. And he said, not that Trinity. And then changed it for another thing. And I thought, that's so much effort for one gag. And that is exactly my style of humour. I love that. And and I've said it, we were talking about this before we started recording, but I'm a dork. And I think that's real dorky humour. And I love that. And I think there's a lot that people miss because they think, Christianity and humour doesn't go together. And you tend to miss out on a lot of really lovely stuff.
Of course, sometimes churches and church services are really funny and they don't mean to be funny.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is also great.
Yeah, so that gets a kind of difficult one. But thinking about comedy and being funny, and thinking about how people are drawn today to vast audiences of people to hear stand-up comics. Theatres have been filled with people that at one time they would have gone to hear a prestigious preacher to preach a sermon, but now they go to hear comedy. But I'm wondering if there's something, because I think is there something more serious going on as people are listening to comedy? Is there some kind of therapeutic thing going on in the audience, and maybe also being worked out in the life of the comedian as the comedian begins to talk about their story, but in actual fact, they're talking about their exploring life. And again, as someone who has watched a lot of Billy Connolly and been a Glaswegian, I actually think Connolly, as he comes to the end of his life, that's exactly some of the things he's been doing. Do you think there's something in all that?
Absolutely. I think that with comedy, first of all, as you said, it's a lot about sharing your own life experiences. And I think a lot of people, when they think of church, they think of sermons, they think it's preaching. It's these are stories from the Bible. We're going to use this as a springboard to tell you what you're doing wrong or what you should be doing or all this. That's the typical idea of what a sermon is. And with comedy, people aren't going because they people know that it's going to be someone talking about themselves. So the pressure's off. The stakes are much lower. You go and you think, I'm going to go have a laugh. And if you learn something, it's not being forced upon you because you're invited to then come and go, actually, I see I can draw comparisons there. I can take what I want from this, but there's no pressure to. Whereas with sermons, I feel like a lot of people feel that if they go, they have to. And it's very confronting, and people don't want to confront things head on. The nice thing about comedy is it sort of sneaks in there, and it's a lot more palatable in that way. And then just finding the funniness in things as well is therapeutic. A lot of us really struggle to feel heavily about things emotionally. There's a lot of things that we will disassociate as soon as we feel sad or angry or grief or anything like that. And so we just disassociate. But we still want to feel happiness and laughter. And sometimes dealing with those emotions through laughter can then allow us later to feel the emotions that we should be feeling and process it.
It's that release, isn't it, that you talked about before? Sometimes
Exactly.
I think that the artist brings the tension. Sometimes the audience brings the tension, at the end of a day or whatever, and they're looking for a release. They're looking for that crescendo that they can release whatever they've brought with them through laughter. One of the things I'm interested about as a Christian in the comedic world is I was listening to a podcast with Dawn French, and she was talking about how the place of the comic is to always push the boundaries in what society says. So always pushing the boundary in terms of what can't be said, pushing the censor over and over again. And so we have a lot of comedy which is in areas now where we wouldn't have talked about that 40 years ago, whether it be sexuality, whether it be mental health, whether it be suicide, whether it be all of these kinds of things. As a Christian coming into a comedic world, do you find any of that difficult for you, or any tensions between you and the perceived comedic world? Or do you find any of that difficult, or is it, no, it's fine, room for everyone?
I think when I started, because when you start, you look for the thing that sets you apart from everyone else, and you sort of build your personality, your voice on that. So when I started, I used to talk about being Christian and some of the more generic elements of that, and just because I thought it was good for people to know that I'm Christian, then build from there. And then as I sort of started to do it more and more, I found that I could move further away from that and just become more about me as a whole person and the way that I take on things. But what I found was that comedians were far more open to, a lot of people thought, because there's so many atheist comedians who are very, very vocal about, the issues that they have with usually the church more than the faith. People think that it's going to be really, really aggressive. And I was surprised by how many people were just open to hearing about it, that had questions or would say, "Oh, I forgot," because you think that when you hear the term Christian, you think of it like with the big capital C. It's a big, it's like this is a label and stuff. But I find that the older I get and the more I sort of explore my faith, I find that Christianity is much more of a relationship rather than a label. In the same way that, yes, I'll loosely call myself a comedian, but I've done a lot more writing and television recently than I have stand-up. And so it's sort of, that label always changes. And I feel like with calling myself a Christian, it's very much aligning myself with the basic principles of it. But everything around it needs to be explored constantly, as you would with any relationship. Your relationship with your friends, your family, anything. It's always going to change depending on the times, what you learn about each other and how we change as people. And yeah, I think it's become a lot more subtle. And it's interesting that the more I get to meet other people, I find that their relationship with faith. I actually did a podcast a long time ago. I don't think it's available anymore, called Gods of Comedy, where we would, my friend Bridie Lee Kennedy and I, who's Catholic, she and I would interview comedians about their beliefs or non-beliefs. And it was fascinating how many who we thought we were going to have some really fiery conversations, and they just became really fascinating. Like, okay, so and this comes from this. Oh, right, that's quite similar to this. And you end up sharing these ideas, and it becomes much more of a community than a nemesis type situation. Yeah.
But earlier you said that actually when the drama teacher said to you, it's harder to be a comic character than it is to be and you said, I always wanted to just be myself on stage. I think there's a vulnerability in expression that comedians have they're much more transparent, aren't they? You bring all of your life, you take the humor from all of your life and you share it with others. Do you find that vulnerability worrying, or are you A-okay with that level of transparency?
I think I'm still dealing. I like to think I'm being transparent, but I think there's a lot of stuff I still don't show. I think I'm very picky with what I'm transparent about. And I think that's because there's some elements of my life that I just don't know how to make funny. And it's not that they're so dark and blah, it's just that in a way that some people can explore those things beautifully and eloquently, my brain doesn't work that way. So it might struggle to say, oh, how can I say this about the human condition and make it palatable? But then on the other side, I might, oh, this sounds like bum. I'm going to make a funny bum picture that goes to this. I think there's, I don't feel like I have to be vulnerable. I think anytime I've tried to do it on purpose in order to get a point across or make points, it's come across as contrived. And it has been. And one thing I'm learning as a comic, again, over time, is to just sort of not force it so much and just trust that if there is anything that needs to be said, whether it's about my faith, whether it's about...
Bums,
exactly, just to let it sort of flow. And in fact, sorry, I wanted to mention this earlier because I don't know, have you heard of The Artist's Way?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
it's a book by Julia Cameron. She wrote it in the early 90s. If anyone reads it, I would bear in mind it was written in the early 90s. There's a couple of things where you're like, oh, okay, it's not problematic, but it's that sort of thing where you go, okay. I mean, first of all, no internet, so no references to that. But essentially, it's a 12-week creativity and spirituality course. And basically, she says that creativity and spirituality are the one and the same. And that she refers to God in it, but she says anyone who's reading should apply whatever they want to that, whether they're atheist or not. She's using the shorthand God, but that can mean anything. But as a basic thing, she's like, if you imagine creativity, God is the creator and created us in order to create. And God is at their happiest when we create. That's when we're at our most godliness, is when we're being creative. And it's very much about tapping into that and using the gifts that we have in order to work on that, and also the gifts of other people and collaboration and things. And so I think sometimes my biggest expression of my faith isn't necessarily in what I say or do on stage, it's how I get there. And I think that's probably the biggest thing, yeah.
It's interesting just hearing you speak, and what comes into my mind is someone once said to me, it's not so much what you say, but it's how people feel after you've left.
That's a really good point.
And I think, that's for someone in what you're doing, but all of us are doing, whether we're preaching a sermon or whether we're just having a conversation. How do we leave them feeling when we've finished? And I was preaching a sermon this Sunday back at my only charge I had. Nobody else would have me, so I stayed there for a long time. But I was preaching on Sunday about shalom. And shalom is a wonderful Hebrew word, but it takes you right into this whole area of creativity. You know where it says in the Bible, in Genesis, and God saw that it was good, and that the pleasure that God takes in creativity, and it's almost like a peace that settles upon God. It's finished. You know that?
Yeah.
You know that essentially, you've done so, it's finished. And shalom is about saying to someone, oh, that you would be completed the way that God wants you and has made you to be.
Oh.
So go and live into that. Lean into what God has made you to be, and look at the creative aim that God has for your life, and lean into it and begin to grow into it. And I think that's what I'm hearing as you're starting to talk here. You're helping us all today to see the journey of making yourself vulnerable, but in making yourself vulnerable, you also make yourself able to connect with other people. One other question I was going to ask you, because you don't mind, because you've been public about it, that as an adult you were diagnosed as having labels. I'm never all that happy with these things, but this label of ADHD. Why did you come out publicly and mention that?
I think, I guess because it's not something that I feel ashamed of or anything. It's interesting. a lot of comedians were diagnosed with it in lockdown, and that's because a lot of comedians suddenly had a lot of time. And I ended up getting the diagnosis because I was doing the clear out that everybody did at the beginning of lockdown, where everyone went, well, I guess I'll finally get around to cleaning the house or going through all my things. And I found an assessment form that my doctor had asked me to fill out 2 years earlier that I'd forgotten to do. And it was because I was worried that I was experiencing premature memory loss because I kept forgetting things or losing track of what I'm saying. I'm sure I'll probably listen back to this podcast and go, you've gone way off topic and you haven't answered the question. I'm fully aware that I have an issue with that. And So I found this sheet because I'd gone to the doctor and said, I'm a bit worried about this. And they asked me a few other questions and they said it could be ADHD. And I remember at the time thinking, and I remember having a teacher when I was a kid suggest to my mum that I had it, but back then it was very much seen as something that naughty kids had, and I wasn't a naughty kid, so that couldn't possibly be the case. And I thought, maybe. And then, obviously forgot to do the form, which should be an instant pass.
Yeah. I love the fact that you went to the doctor because you were forgetting things and then you forgot to do the form.
Forgot to do the thing.
Just brilliant.
Yeah. And so I finally filled it out. And it's funny because it also asks anyone you live with to fill it out as well so they can give their perspective. And I'd actually said, I'm not too bad at losing things. I lose sometimes, but not more than anyone else. And then my husband was filling his out and it said, do they lose things? And he was like, yes, all the time. And it turns out I think I'm not losing things, but it's because he picks them up after me and makes sure I don't forget them. So he was filling it out and then, and then send it off, and then you have an assessment with a psychiatrist and they diagnose that. And it gave me a really interesting perspective on something where there's still a lot of things I want to get better at. And I don't think that having this stops me from working on those. But I also found that it made a lot of other things clear, and it made our relationship a lot easier because I leave things out all the time, and my husband's very tidy. My mum's very tidy, and all these years I'd sort of kept thinking, why can't I clean up? Why is it so difficult for me? And then I realized, it's because I need things to be out. Otherwise, if I can't see them, they've gone. Yeah. And I won't remember anything. So it's like having, I can't even have a to-do list in a closed book. It has to be open. I have to be able to see it. Otherwise, I won't remember it and I won't tick it off. And so we're only in a 1-bedroom flat with no garden. And I was working in the kitchen, at a desk in the kitchen, and it was feeling very claustrophobic. And getting the diagnosis and realizing these elements about me, I was able to finally sort of say to my husband, I need a room, I need a space to work in so that I can be me, and then everything else can be the order that you want. And so we ended up moving our bed into the lounge, which is now called the blounge. So we've got a bed, it's almost like a bed sit situation, and so the old bedroom's now my office, so I can move the desk from the kitchen into there. And so it now means that all the other living areas and the bathroom and everything, that's all kept neat and tidy. I can keep those tidy. I have no issue with that. But in the space that I work in, that's very messy. And it could be as messy as I like it to be, as long as we can shut the door and he can't see it. And it just made a huge difference to the relationship. And I just think those sorts of understandings, when you have them, for me, it making such a big difference in my life and giving me the language I needed to communicate different things that I was having difficulties with the people around me. I thought, actually, this might help other people as well. And I'm not there to diagnose anyone else, but to just say, if you relate to these things, perhaps look at it in this light and see if that helps. And you can use it, even if you're not diagnosed with it specifically, the tools still help. So, that was why I decided to be a bit more public.
What a good piece of practical advice to give to people, even if you say they've not been diagnosed with anything, just making space for one another to be able to live our lives and understanding one another. It's been a great podcast. Yeah. I've really enjoyed being with you and hearing, and we've covered a lot of ground. Yeah,
and talking about covering ground, I noticed on your website that you're going to be in Manchester soon, and then Bedford as well.
Yes, I'm hosting the QED conference, which is the Skeptics Conference, which I think is very. I find it very funny that they've asked me to host it, but I weirdly do count myself as quite a skeptic, in the sense that I think skepticism involves having to be quite open-minded, because it's when people say that something is this and it's nothing else, and I think that's when we need to be skeptical. And so I would say that it's a healthy thing to have and to be, and you can have a faith and be skeptic at the same time. And so I think it's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to some of the talks.
And also, for those of you that are listening to this immediately, you've got one more little slot, haven't you, in Comedy for Kids?
Yes, Comedy Club for Kids at the Assembly Roxy.
And that's on Thursday, the 15th?
Wednesday the 16th.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you've got some kids out there that want to come and hear some comedy, then you can come along to that as well.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. It's basically a comedy club where kids are allowed. There'll be jokes for the parents that won't, scar your children for life.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being part of our podcast today. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you and hearing your story and your journey. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, we would love to get your comments, because we do look at the comments and create maybe an interaction. And I'm quite sure that Beck will look at it as well, and we can be able to maybe develop a conversation through this podcast, because it's important that you feel part of what we've been discussing today. So we want to thank you for being part of our podcast and for sharing with us, and encourage you to listen into our podcasts all through Faith at the Fringe, because we've got more really interesting podcasts coming up. And the next one is going to be about music and the big band sound. So have a look and a listen and a look out for that one. But until next time, huge thank you to you, Beck, for being with us, and to Hannah, and to you for being with us as part of our Faith at the Fringe.